All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the North American Invasive Species Management Association webinar. Today is May 15th, and today our webinar speaker is Carrie Brown-Lima. Carrie is the director of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Carrie has over 20 years working with a wide variety of organizations on conservation strategies and natural resource management, ecological research, and outreach in the United States and in Latin America. Carrie's experience includes promoting partnerships, creating programs, coordinating international, national, and state level workshops and strategy building. Carrie received her bachelor science degree in biology from Keene State College and her master's degree in natural resources from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and is presently a kinship conservation fellow at Cornell. So with that, I'm going to welcome Carrie Brown-Lima, who will talk today about bridging the gap between invasive species research and management in New York State and beyond.
Thanks so much, Belle, and thank you for the invitation to give this webinar. I'm really excited to be here today, particularly in light of the fact that we are going to be co-hosting the NYISRI 2019 conference here in New York State. And I'll get back to this a little bit later on in my talk, at the end of my talk, to give it a plug and to tell you a little more about it. But for now, I'm really just wanting to use this to kick off my talk because the theme of this year's conference, Connecting Science to Action, is something that we've been thinking a lot about here in New York State and through the New York Invasive Species Research Institute program. And so today I'd like to take advantage of this hour that we have together to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in New York State, our overall invasive species programming structure here in New York State, give a little bit of background on this area of connecting science to management and invasive species, and then provide some examples of some of the programs and projects that we've started in an attempt to bridge that gap. So let me dive right in with the first part of my talk, which is talking a little bit about New York State's invasive species. And for some of you out there, our over 400 invasive species may not seem like a lot. I know down in Florida, every time I give a talk there, I say, wow, we don't really have as many invasive species as other places, but we do have quite a large invasive species problem. Particularly our non-native forest pests have had a really big impact on our forests and caused quite a bit of damage. We have more invasive forest pests here in New York than any other state. And we also have a lot of movement of goods coming in and out of New York and a long history of that happening, which has allowed us to get a lot of new introductions and also to have our guard up for new invasives coming in. And so with that in mind, back in 2003, our governor at the time, Governor Pataki, called for an invasive species task force to explore invasive species issues and provide him some recommendations and the government some recommendations on what New York could do as a state to address this huge and growing problem. So the task force went out and came back 2 years later with a report with 12 recommendations to address invasive species in New York State. And now I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I would like to highlight some of the organizational structure that came as a result of these recommendations, as well as the programs and actions that New York has taken. And the first one is that we here in New York have established a leadership structure much like that we have at a national level. We have an invasive species council that's made up of 9 agencies, and it's co-chaired by our Department of Environmental Conservation and our Department of Agriculture and Markets. And then we have an advisory committee, much like the one at the national level, made up of NGOs, industry, academia that provides guidance to the council. And the overall coordinating body for this is the New York State Environmental Conservation Invasive Species Coordination Unit. We also have 8 regional partnerships for regional invasive species management. And this is a really great program because all of New York State is actually covered by these partnerships for regional invasive species management. And from this point forward, I'm going to call them PRISMs by their acronym. And they're responsible from everything from planning, invasive species management, early detection, and eradication programs, education. They coordinate with all the other organizations that are addressing invasive species and want to be part of the partnership. And they recruit volunteers and also encourage citizen scientists to collect data. So they have a really important role. There are boots on the ground organizations here. And they are hosted by a number of different organizations, ranging from the Nature Conservancy to universities, to nature centers, and they all have their own unique way of functioning and their own unique programming, but they all work together as one team. Here in New York State, we use IMAP Invasives as our invasive species database. And IMAP Invasives actually just launched their 3.0 version, which not only allows us to collect data on the presence of invasive species in the state, but also we can start recording things like abundance, treatments, and go back and record treatment effectiveness. And also we can record not presence, which is really important data when we survey an area and we find that the species isn't there, we're able to record that for certain species as well, which is really important information to have. And then the New York Invasive Species Research Institute was also one of these recommendations with the idea that we would communicate and coordinate invasive species research to prevent and manage the impact of invasive species in New York State and beyond. And this is what I'm going to spend a portion of my talk talking about. But for now, I just wanted to show you this overall structure and how we all interact and work together to address invasive species at a state level. And among all of these organizations and structures, we have invasive species regulations and prohibited species lists. We have campaigns, outreach campaigns. We have management activities taking place ranging from biocontrol to manual removal, data collection, and also employing technology for detection at a statewide level. Unfortunately, along with these recommended actions, they also gave us funding, and this funding comes from the New York State Environmental Protection Fund, which is a real estate transfer tax that then contributes to promoting environmental programming in New York. And we've had a steady line of funding since about 2006, and that's increased over the years as the demands have increased and as the programming has expanded. So I'd like to start getting back now to the core topic of my talk, which is bridging the gap between invasive species research and management. And I'd like to talk about what is the gap, why does it exist, and how can we integrate invasive species research and management. Now, when Governor Pataki came out with the task force and they recommended the Research Institute, this wasn't the first time that people recognized the need for invasive species research and management, or just in general research and management and policymaking to be connected. Even over 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson said, "The man who has the time, the discrimination, and the sagacity to collect and comprehend the principal facts, and the man who must act upon them, must draw near to one another and feel they are engaged in a common enterprise." Now, 100 years later, President Obama also recognized the importance of research, and in the amendment to the executive order on invasive species, really highlighted the need to apply innovative science and technology. And obviously, it goes into a lot more depth in the executive order, but that was a real focus of this amendment. And the National Invasive Species Council Secretariat also took that one step further and coined the phrase, "We can do this," and promoted innovation and science and technology as a path to help us better address invasive species problems in the country. And we've really seen a huge increase in the number of research articles that are published monthly on invasive species. And now this graph here only goes through September 2011. So it doesn't give, it looks like that might be dropping off, but I don't have a more recent graph that shows the number of invasive species research articles published, but this is an ever-growing number. And so we really have a great interest from the research community out there to understand invasive species and help address the problem through their research. However, there's also a group of researchers and mentors that are recognizing that there's still a big gap between what we're doing research on and how that information is being applied. And MassTech in 2014 published an article in Conservation Letters, and she called this the knowing doing gap, and she said there's a gap between research and practice so that scientific information accumulates but is not incorporated into management action. So this gives us the vision of this big pool of information accumulating but never actually making its way to the people who could use it. And this, I've been really digging in to understand how research translates into action, and have found this article by Enquist et al. On Foundations of Translational Ecology provided some really interesting definitions for the way research gets translated into action. And one of their definitions talks about the trickle-down approach. And so the idea is that researchers would publish this information and then for their academic peers to read about, and that eventually this relevant knowledge would trickle down by unspecified means to decision makers. Now, this term really kind of made me laugh because it made me think of trickle-down economics, which I've heard over the years and growing up in the 80s, that when it was really being promoted, that it's a concept that doesn't really work that well, and that without real action to transfer knowledge or to transfer resources, that's not just going to happen on its own. And MassTech continued on in this 2014 article to talk about why that trickle-down effect isn't actually happening. And what she found when she interviewed invasive plant managers, those that are actually making decisions on invasive species management, she found that very few of them were actually getting their information from peer-reviewed journals. In fact, if this graph was drawn to scale, peer-reviewed journals would be way off of my screen. And that really invasive species managers are looking to, they get a lot of their information from their own experiments, their own on-the-ground knowledge that they've acquired over the years, and from sharing that knowledge with their peers, also books and newsletters and other synthesized information and conference symposium attendance, and not really from the journals at all. So that would show us that the trickle-down approach really won't work, particularly in invasive species, and that there has to be some sort of knowledge transfer where we're actually taking that information and bringing it out to the people that are making decisions and need it. However, we've also found that that doesn't always work as well. And one of the problems with that is that a lot of times the research that's being produced doesn't exactly answer the questions that the decision makers have. And so it's kind of like fitting a round peg in a square hole, where you can kind of squeeze it in to make it fit, but there's a lot of gaps around the edges and there's information that you're missing. And so, you know, we've started to think a little bit more about why that's happening. Why is it that the research isn't matching the management? And a lot of times research agendas and their motivations are really different than what managers' motivations for information are. Researchers want interesting questions, they're testing big ideas. The results are sometimes difficult to access and interpret. They're working in unrealistic timeframes, making generalizations. And where managers really need context-specific, solution-oriented results. And so in order for that to happen, there has to be some sort of communication between the two worlds, and they can't live in these silos that are depicted here on the screen. And so, you know, although knowledge transfer can be a helpful way of sharing information and getting the research out there, really knowledge co-production is the way we should be thinking about this if we want to get usable and actionable science. And so they define here knowledge co-production as the process of producing usable and actionable science through collaboration between scientists and those who use science to make policy and management decisions. And so co-production of knowledge really is a situation where managers are identifying the research needs and participating in the research process, and the researchers are tailoring the research to answer the questions. And we can really start thinking about this as a new model where science is driving management decisions and managers are participating in directing research. And policy is also learning from both of those and connected to both of those. And from that, we'd actually get actionable science, which they define as data analysis, projection, or tools that can support decisions in natural resource management, including not only information, but guidance on the appropriate use of that information. So now we know that the answer, if we all get together, researchers, managers, we can produce actionable science, and that will help us to make better decisions. So is that the end? Is that the answer? And is this really happening? And so if you dig into the research articles, there's actually a number of researchers that have been publishing on this, not just NASTech, but others that are really trying to understand why this isn't happening. What are the reasons why invasive species managers aren't using the science that the researchers are producing, and why they're not talking more? And Mark Renz from University of Wisconsin and his collaborators actually surveyed some researchers and managers in the Midwest to try to understand this situation. And what they found through these interviews, when they interviewed both scientists and researchers, they found that 93% of people, the participants, ranked collaboration between land managers and researchers as high importance, like we really should be doing this. But then 90% of them who said that also said that their current level of collaboration among these groups was low to medium. So when they asked why, the reasons were really the lack of time and money. You see, managers and researchers, that's really not part of their jobs. And so researchers aren't getting rewarded through the academic system for spending time to get out there to communicate and coordinate and collaborate with managers. And managers usually have such a busy schedule and so many tasks on their long list that they don't have the time to do that either. And so in order for this perfect relationship to take place, there's some investment that needs to happen. And so getting back to this NYISRI et al. Article that I was talking about earlier that's looking at translational ecology, they recognize that there's this realm of translational ecology that is actually along the boundary of practice and research. And in this realm, there's usually a bridging organization or a bridging individual of some sort that actually has the job to do the coordination, the collaboration, the communication that takes so much time and energy. So here in New York State, the Research Institute is actually that bridging organization for our invasive species network. And I'd like to kind of shift into now how we've been working as a research institute to bridge this gap, and then give you some examples of the projects that we've been advancing to address this. So first of all, right out of the gates, we really have to understand the research landscape. What kind of research is being done? Who's doing it? Where are they doing it? How are they doing it? And then also facilitate information sharing. So that kind of that unidirectional transfer of knowledge that I mentioned back in the beginning of my talk. And we do that through some of the traditional methods of conferences, webinars, websites, digests, documentaries, and so on. But then to dig down deeper and really understand and start this co-production process, we really need to understand from the stakeholders, from our PRISMs and partners, what are their research needs and priorities so that we can put those into action. So we actually take an annual survey of the PRISMs and other stakeholders to get an idea of what information or what kinds of areas they think we should be addressing, and then we've ranked them over time to try to get an idea of which ones are the most important to most of the stakeholders. And then once we know the answer to that question, we can coordinate research and promote collaboration to address those needs. And then the fifth area that we work, beyond just addressing the specific research needs, and this is an area that I really enjoy, is when new innovative or cross-discipline solutions that maybe weren't what people requested, but things that we can, from having our bird's eye view of the situation, that we're able to pick out and actually foster and bring into implementation. So just to summarize that, some of the areas in general that have been identified by our managers and by NYISRI are things like understanding the biology and impact of invasive species, understanding emerging issues, developing and implementing and measuring effectiveness of invasive species management strategies such as biocontrol and other traditional strategies, introducing, developing, and testing new early detection technology, engaging other disciplines, and translation from science to policy. And so in each of those areas, I'm going to provide an example of some of the work that we've been doing. And the first one, I'm going to jump back right now to the executive order from Obama, the amendment to the executive order back in 2016. And in addition to really highlighting science and technology as a solution, they say that federal agencies should be considering climate change when working on issues relevant to the prevention, eradication, and control of invasive species. However, one of our top research priorities that was identified was managers really wondering, how can we manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change? What does this mean, and how does this translate into things we can actually put in our management plans? And some of the challenges that we found when I started looking into this issue is that we didn't know, that's a really general question, so we didn't know exactly what kind of information managers would need to improve their decisions. And then also the existing research is kind of spread throughout the scientific literature, and it wasn't really directed at addressing manager needs, and some of it was still in pretty early stages. So as I started thinking more deeply about this, I very luckily had the opportunity to meet Tony Lynn Morelli from the Northeast Climate Science Center and Bethany Bradley from UMass. And we started talking about this issue, and we all decided that this was something that we'd like to address collaboratively. And in 2016, we held an exploratory workshop where we invited managers and researchers who were kind enough to come and share what their needs were, what their perceived needs were, and the kinds of things that, the kinds of research that we might want to do in order to address their needs. So that from there developed into a really cool collaboration that I've enjoyed a lot. It's called the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network. And so we call this the RISC network. And since that time, we've held 2 annual symposiums at UMass with invasive species managers and researchers from around the Northeast, and actually researchers from around the world that have come to share the knowledge and also share their experiences, the managers, their on-the-ground experiences with this topic. We've developed a listserv with over 250 members now, where we share through this listserv information on our meetings, but also research summaries a couple times a month, and as well as more synthesized management documents to kind of to boil down the information on some of the top topics in invasive species and climate change. And so these, you can find these on our site, and I'll put those up later. And also, this is just an example of the, when we summarize the research and send them out, this is just what people are getting in their inbox. But also one of the things that we've been doing is bringing together researchers and managers to identify what kinds of projects would be most useful for them. And so Jenica Allen from University of New Hampshire had embarked on taking climate projections and then looking at range shifting plant species and trying to come up with lists so that states could be prepared for which species might likely to be moving into their state under certain, some of the climate projections that she was working with. And this was a really interesting tool interesting research, because actually when we talked to the managers, this was one of the things they most wanted to know. What species should we be looking out for? And then they can start thinking proactively. Here in New York, Jenica provided us a list, and normally we wouldn't be analyzing and assessing invasive species for prohibited and regulated species lists prior to them coming to the state or knocking on our door. But through Jenica's work, this allowed us to really start assessing some of these species and considering them proactively for inclusion in the prohibited and regulated species list. And then through these researcher-manager discussions, Jenica decided to actually turn this into a tool that's going to be hosted by EdMaps and may already be on EdMaps, where managers can actually go in on their own and use the tool to generate lists of which species they should be keeping an eye out for under certain climate conditions. So if you want to get more information on some of these initiatives, programs, our listserv, and so on, you can check out the website, join the listserv, or send an email to us through our risk email. All right, so I'm going to move along then from climate change to another top request that we get from our managers are for to advance biocontrol research on some of their hardest to manage and most widespread invasive species. And so here in New York, I really see biocontrol as a leading example of co-production. The development of new biocontrol agents has really been encouraged by these manager-identified species, the species they really want to see the researchers drill down and start working on. And also, once the species are approved, our network is really essential for supporting and coordinating the release of existing agents together with researchers to actually evaluate the establishment and effectiveness of those agents. So this has been, we actually have several research programs underway right now, some associated with the Research Institute and others that are funded through other agencies. But this has been a great way to really come up with longer term solutions. And one that I've been particularly spending a lot of time at the Research Institute working on was a recently approved, I believe it was about a year and a half ago now, that the biocontrol for black and pale swallower, Hypena opulenta, was approved for release in the US. And so before that time, there were some researchers at URI that they're the ones that developed it, and also Lindsay Milbrath here at the USDA based in Ithaca, New York, was doing research on it. But we didn't have a team in place to actually implement the release, the evaluation, and also come up with a methodology for mass rearing here in New York State to provide the insect. So with the collaborators from 5 research institutions, the Research Institute was able to bring everyone together and come up with a plan for how this should take place. And we also communicated this with the Department of Transportation here in New York, who was able to access funding from a federal source, $750,000 for this project. So by having an organization that could bring together the researchers, and actually swallowwort was identified as a top concern here in New York because managers are having such a hard time dealing with it using conventional methods, that, you know, with this incentive from the managers, having the bridging organization to coordinate it, the NYISRI to coordinate it, we were able to bring together the funding, the researchers, and get a process. This project is underway now, and it's really an exciting collaboration that came out of this manager need. And also on top of that, the Research Institute was able to obtain funding from USDA to do outreach and to train, eventually use the researchers' monitoring protocol to put that into IMAP and train managers to be able to monitor the effectiveness of the species. So it's been a really cool, it's still underway, and a really cool partnership, and it's still underway, and we're looking forward to repeating this for other biocontrol agents as they become available. So another area that we've really received a lot of interest and a lot of requests for information on is how can we measure whether our invasive species management activities are effective or not. And this is something that's still in under development because it's very specific to individual species and context. But one of the problems that I think an overarching problem in invasive species that we have is that we spend a lot of money to manage, but the funding agencies and our current tasks don't allow us the time to actually monitor after we've managed to see if we're effective. And I pulled this from Quirian et al. 2018, which I'll talk about a little more in my next slide. But for example, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative had spent over $25 million for Phragmites management over a 5-year period. But the reports only documented the success based on how much was spent or the amount of areas that were treated, and not really whether they achieved their goal of reducing Phragmites. So one of our partners, our prisms, the Adirondack prism here, they had been monitoring their Phragmites management to see when they were effective. And then they partnered with some researchers here at Cornell to analyze that data. And they really found that they had a very little probability, very, very low, almost impossible to eradicate Phragmites if the stand was any bigger than the size of my office that I'm sitting in right now. And so really what they were finding is that they should really focus, if they're looking to eradicate, they should really focus on small stands, and they should understand that they might not reach that goal if they were looking at larger stands. So this was a really interesting evaluation, and it was thanks to this researcher PRISM partnership that they were able to take that. They published that data in Biological Invasions back in 2018, and really got the message out both to researchers and managers. We have another example of a researcher manager partnership that was facilitated by the Research Institute, where our parks here in New York were really interested to know whether their swallowwort management efforts were effective at all. And so through the Research Institute and its connections with Dr. Andrea Davalos at a New York university based here in Cortland, New York, they partnered up, and they've been working for the past couple of years to design a monitoring protocol and a research project to actually look at effectiveness of their different management techniques. And so hopefully, for those of you who are participating in the NYISRI conference this fall, here in Saratoga, Dr. Davalos will be presenting on that. Oh, and I should mention on that note also, the risk management, the climate change and invasive species program will also be presenting 2 sessions on invasive species and climate change. So another area related to this, and part of the issue is that sometimes when we set out on invasive species projects, we don't actually set clear objectives that can be measured. And this is an area that both Dr. Davalos and also the Adirondack Prism have been working with. This idea that partnering with researchers, it makes it possible to not only set objectives and implement the control strategy, but then the help that they can provide in analyzing that and adapting that. And using an adaptive management framework is a really great way to facilitate this partnership between managers and researchers and help them get some real information about the effectiveness of our control strategies. So let's see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I've got a few more minutes. Another project that came out of a great demand from our partners across the state was the fact that we have so many species, we have so many areas, and we have so many ways we could address those. It's really hard to decide where to allocate our limited resources. And I know this is a problem that most invasive species managers deal with. We always have too many problems to be managed with the amount of resources that we have. And so priorities need to be set. they brought this question to the Research Institute, and we started working with structured decision making and with some decision scientists, and then we ended up partnering up with some computer scientists and our New York State Invasive Species Database, IMAP Invasive, to develop a tool that could help us improve our decision making and optimize our decisions so that we're investing in the right areas for the right species. And this has been actually a really challenging project, as you can imagine. I know a number of different organizations and institutions over time have tried to do this, but what's been really exciting about this is working cross-discipline with the computer scientists, and also the complete involvement of our Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, who have really helped us by providing expert opinion and contributing data to this so that we can help develop this tool. And this is another work in progress, but that has been a real interesting and great learning experience for all of us, and we look forward to seeing how this all turns out and using this tool down the road. So moving along, we've talked about management, we've talked about emerging needs such as climate change, but one area that's really been developing quite rapidly are new technologies and techniques for the early detection of invasive species. And since the science on these moves so quickly, it's really important for scientists and managers to be engaged, and that doesn't always happen that easily. And so here in New York State, we were getting a lot of interest in eDNA and implementing eDNA, and also developing new tools for certain species using eDNA. And we were fortunate enough to have David Lodge recently move to New York State to take on a position here at Cornell. So together with David Lodge, in order to address this need, we put together an environmental DNA workshop, and we brought together over 100 researchers and managers from New York State, where we presented the researchers presented their research and the state of their research. The managers presented on their programs and how they've been using eDNA, and they also talked about the difficulties they have when certain information or results from eDNA research comes out without consulting them and without going through their communications channels. And so this was a really productive conversation that took place over the course of a day, and actually developed a number of researcher manager partnerships to follow. And it also gave us together to come up with some proposed solutions on how the research community and the manager community could work together on this. And really, we identified that we needed to improve communications and to create more of a communications network. Also, to really understand and be able to identify quality labs, perhaps through a certification. And this is all still in the process of being developed. But it also showed us that there was many opportunities to use eDNA for both invasive and native species detection that we weren't really using yet. And so by bringing people together in the same room, it was a really great opportunity to come up with some ideas on ways to improve our interactions. And I'm moving in towards the end here, and another area that I had talked about when I was listing off the priorities is the idea that we really need better understanding overall. You know, we can think about wanting to manage species, but we really need to, as we're deciding which species we should be managing and where we should be managing them, we really need to know more about the biology and the impact of invasive species. And we also need to, it's really tough to separate when you have so many different factors, you know, changes in our environment, whether it's overabundant ungulate populations, pollution, land use change, climate change. You know, it's hard to tease apart whether invasive species are actually driving the negative effects that we're seeing in our environment, or whether they're actually just along for the ride and taking advantage of the disturbance. And so in order to prioritize and choose the right species to manage, this kind of information and this kind of research is really crucial. And I'd just like to walk through one example that we've been thinking about here in New York State and that some researchers in New York had taken on. Just to give an example of a driver species, we here in the Northeast and in the East, on the East Coast, we have Hemlock Delegate, which is really devastating our hemlocks, which make up a large portion of our forest and causing a lot of ecological degradation and changes in our forests. However, there's other species that appear to be spreading and appear to be having really negative impacts that we really aren't sure whether they're a driver or a passenger. And in fact, I was reading up online, looking at some classes, curriculum that people had put together on invasives, and I saw that, Japanese nils, it was saying that Japanese stiltgrass displaced native species. And I question that only because I know in some circumstances it could, but there's actually some research here in New York that has been showing otherwise. And so at the same time as we're seeing an increase in Japanese stiltgrass and in other invasive plants, we're also seeing an increase in our white-tailed deer population. And for those of you that know anything about white-tailed deer, they actually eat a lot. They really prefer native vegetation, and they can eat a lot of it in a small period of time. And so this is a native oak planting experiment to assess the impacts of white-tailed deer. As you can see from the number of plants this deer took down in the 20 seconds that this video took place, you can only imagine the impact, particularly if they were selecting for native species. And so some researchers here at Cornell took on this question and started fencing out deer to see how it impacted invasive species populations. And what they found is that when you took deer out, Japanese stiltgrass populations decreased very significantly, and also that the native species were able to come back and to compete with it. And so that statement that was made in the class slide that I showed a couple slides ago, saying that it was eliminating native vegetation wasn't accurate in this context. The group, which was led by Baron Blasi and Andrea Davalos and other researchers, in addition to looking at the amount of stiltgrass, they also planted in native trillium to see how they would do, and they found that trillium without deer were taller and had more stems. And even that the stiltgrass was not preventing them from growing. In fact, seedlings in stiltgrass did even better than emerging than they did outside of stiltgrass. And so it wasn't really the stiltgrass that was eliminating the native vegetation. In this situation, it was actually the white-tailed deer. And this kind of situation, this kind of information is really important as you're making decisions about your management priorities. And lastly, before I wrap up here, there's one more really great opportunity for taking the knowledge that we have in the academic literature and applying it to policy decisions. A lot of times we need to make decisions on ways to prevent or manage, or the policies that we should be making to prevent or manage species. And having information from the scientific literature is really useful to support those. We've worked particularly in this area in regards to forest pests, and we spent a lot of time working with Gary Lovett in his research on non-native forest insects and pathogens, where his research group actually not only looked at the impacts and of the forest pests, they also talked about policy changes that could be made in order to prevent further introductions. And so the Research Institute really took a role in helping to get that information out to our council and our policymakers here in New York State. We've also been working to try to bridge policy decision making with science in regards to spotted lanternfly, and also with southern pine beetle when it moved into New York back in 2014. And so this is also a great opportunity in an area that's proved to be a really important area that needs more attention for bridging the gap. So in wrapping up, some of the summarizing points are that bridging organizations such as NYISRI can help to make some of these projects happen and are sometimes essential for them to happen. The research needs need to be solicited for managers if we want to really design research that can improve the way management and policy decisions are made. Researchers are really open when they are approached with a clear question to getting involved in research projects. I've had such great feedback and engagement from researchers, and so communicating with them about our needs really can result in the research being taken on. And I think using adaptive management and assessments of success should be a part of the research and management funding that the funding organizations are getting out to allow the researchers and managers to understand the effectiveness of the work they're doing. And we as a group need to advocate for this kind of funding. I don't think that it's that obvious that this kind of funding could really improve the effectiveness of what we're doing. And so with that, I just want to wrap up by giving an extra plug for the NYISMA meeting, this NYISMA-NYISRI joint conference that's going to take place from September 30th through October 3rd here in New York. Some of the research projects that I talked about are going to be highlighted at this conference. And it's just Saratoga Springs is such a great area. I've really enjoyed the time I've been able to spend there in planning the conference. It's at the foothills of the Adirondacks, so if you're an outdoor enthusiast, there's a lot of opportunity for you to tack on a little time. The city itself is just charming and has a lot of history, from sports, being the first sports facility in the U.S. with its racetrack at Saratoga Springs, to some of the other interesting historical points. Just hope you all can join us, and it's going to be a great conference. And I thank Belle and the other coordinators from NYISMA for inviting me here today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carrie. That was a really fantastic presentation. Really sparked some questions in my mind. But I'm going to open it up to our participants and attendees today. For those watching the webinar, there is on your dialog box for the webinar, there's a little tab that says questions. You can type in a question right there, and we'll just go down the line and answer any questions that folks have. So I'll give folks a minute to think about a question and type it in there. And while you're thinking, Carrie, I wondered if you had any insight into, so you mentioned that, your institute is bridging that gap between the science and management. And I wondered if you think that does it need to be an academic institution like yours that does that bridging, or do you think could it be something else like a nonprofit or an agency? Or do you think the way that your institute is set up is particularly suited to do this? Yeah, just kind of curious about your insights on who and what kind of bridging organization.
So that's a really good question. And so it's interesting that, my institution is set up at Cornell University, but I've actually seen a lot of instances where a nonprofit like the Nature Conservancy can serve in that role, or, cooperative extension groups can do that. I think that there's really no limits to what kind of organization could be effective. I think the one thing that makes it work is if someone is dedicated to that cause. And that's what allows the bridging to happen. I think it doesn't necessarily matter what institution that organization is sitting in.
Great. Yeah. I also think, I wonder if, I think part of it is having someone or a group of people who are willing to kind of open the sort of maybe inherent barriers that are in their own discipline and their field. And, I wonder if there sort of needs to be an opportunity um, to open up that space and get people outside of their boxes and sort of in preparation for being able to work across those boundaries.
Yeah, I also, and I said this a couple times throughout in my wrap up, but I think, having that be identified as an important part of programs by funding agencies is also an important step to allow people to do that kind of work.
Absolutely. Well, so far I have not seen any questions come through. I'll give folks another minute if there are any other questions folks have on their mind for Carrie. I guess one more question. Here's the question. Claire Ryan asks, could you talk a little bit more about how you get the findings of your research needs surveys to researchers? And do you have success stories where a researcher has taken up a question generated by the surveys?
So the first part of the question is an interesting one that we are trying to improve. I mean, some of it just happens through us going out and talking to people about them. This year, the state of New York, actually, the Department of Environmental Conservation actually put out a call for proposals for some research, and then they used the list of priorities that we had, the needs that we had generated through our consultations with the PRISMs to guide some of the applicants on the kinds of things they were looking for. So that was really useful. We do have a link from our website, I believe. Right now, I don't know whether it's updated, but that's another way. And we're really looking for better ways to get that information out there. I do know that other institutes, like in Minnesota, they actually put an RFP out specifically for research proposals based on the research priorities they identify as well. And so, yeah, that's an area that we could probably spend more time delving into, and I think we will down the road.
Super. Here's another question from Slade Franklin. How much of New York annual budget is utilized by the CWMAs for direct management, and how much is utilized for research?
So definitely a lot more for management than for research. In fact, the first year, this was the first year that actually research grants were given out, even though a couple of the projects had been funded that I talked about by funds from the invasive species line. Within each PRISM, it's not a fixed amount, and so I don't really know the exact percentage, but I would say significantly more for management than for research. And we've actually applied and worked with people to apply for outside funding to fund some of these research projects. So that tends to take a little longer to get it implemented, not always having a line for research.
Super. Thank you. Here's another question from David Cottle. Have you worked with the Science Partner Program spearheaded by the U.S. Forest Service Research Branch?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that either.
But I'd love more information on it. If you have a link that you want to put in the chat box, or even my email's on the screen, if you want to just shoot me an email with the link, that'd be really fantastic.
That'd be great.
I do interact quite a bit with the Forest Service, though, just more in getting information and in information sharing.
Super. All right, David says he'll send an email. Great. Any other last questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you all for participating and joining us today, taking time out of your schedules. And thank you again, Carrie, for this excellent presentation. I know it's sparked some ideas in my mind, and I hope for others as well. I think this is a great model that could work with a lot of, ideally every state or region in the U.S. and potentially outside the country as well. So thank you again, and please stay tuned, everyone, for future NAISMA webinars. We have them monthly on the third Wednesday of the month. You can check them out at naisma.org, and we hope to see you, as Carrie mentioned, at our conference coming up this fall. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Belle, and thanks, everyone.